banished, shamed, erased from memory. That was Eloise Fairwind's punishment the night London society decided her face wasn't beautiful enough to deserve space in their glittering world. One humiliating remark, one moment of public cruelty, one powerful duke who chose cold silence when he could have shown kindness. That was all it took. By dawn, her stepmother had made the decision for everyone. Eloise would be sent away, far from the ballrooms and chandeliers, far from every eye that had looked at her and found her wanting. They thought the wild coast would swallow her whole, that she'd wither away in obscurity, forgotten by the very world that had judged her so mercilessly. They were catastrophically wrong, because in that isolated, wind-swept place, Eloise stopped asking if she was pretty enough, and started discovering who she could become when nobody was watching. Hello, my dear friend. I'm your storyteller for this evening. If you've ever felt invisible, pushed aside, or told you weren't enough, this story is for you. Stay with me, leave a like if these tales speak to your heart, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, as we follow Eloise Fairwind from banishment to the moment a duke finally sees her true worth. London, April 1862. The crystal chandeliers of Ashford Manor blazed with 1,000 candles, casting honey gold light across marble floors so meticulously polished they reflected the dancers like troubled water. Lady Eloise Fairwind stood near the conservatory archway, half concealed behind an arrangement of hothouse orchids, and wondered, not for the first time that evening, why she had allowed herself to be brought here at all. The answer, of course, glittered across the ballroom in emerald silk and diamonds. Miss Seraphina Grafton, her stepsister in everything but blood. The reigning beauty of the season, with golden ringlets that caught lamplight like spun sugar, and eyes the colour of cornflowers in summer. Seraphina moved through the crowd like a comet, trailing admirers in her brilliant wake. And beside her, orchestrating every perfect moment, stood Lady Honoria Vexley, Eloise's stepmother, a woman who collected social victories the way some collected rare paintings, and who had long ago determined that Eloise's role in the family portrait was to make Seraphina shine all the brighter by comparison. At 23, Eloise understood exactly what society thought of her. The whispers had followed her through 5 seasons now, faithful as shadows. Poor plain Eloise, such an unfortunate face. At least she has gentle manners. She had learned over years of such assessments to make herself small, unobtrusive. If she could not be beautiful, perhaps she could be invisible, and invisibility, she had discovered, could be kinder than scrutiny. Her gown of pale lavender muslin hung simply from her shoulders, modest in cut, where other women wore elaborate creations that required doorways to be navigated sideways. The fabric whispered against her legs as she shifted position, a quiet sound lost beneath the rustle of silk and the bright laughter that seemed always, somehow, to be at someone else's expense. Her chestnut hair was arranged in plain braids that required no lady's maid's expertise, adorned only by her late mother's cameo brooch. It was the single piece of jewelry she owned that hadn't been sold to settle her father's debts after his death. Eloise's grey-green eyes moved across the glittering assembly with the practiced observation of someone who had spent a lifetime watching rather than participating. She catalogued the room's geography with quiet efficiency. The receiving line where Lady Ashford held court, the dance floor where couples waltzed in intricate patterns, the refreshment tables laden with champagne and delicacies most guests would barely touch. And there, near the grand staircase, stood the gravitational centre of every female gaze in the room. Duke Alistair Hawthorne of Ravencrest was 31 years old and possessed the kind of aristocratic bearing that seemed etched into his very bones. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell just slightly over his collar and eyes the colour of winter storms. He wore his black evening coat with the casual perfection of a man who had never questioned his right to command any space he occupied. He stood among a cluster of gentlemen, but there was no question who dominated the group. The Honourable Lord Fitzwilliam, shorter and more animated with auburn hair and an easy laugh, leaned close to murmur something that made the Duke's mouth curve in what might have been amusement. Around them, other lords orbited like lesser planets around the sun. Eloise had been observing the Duke peripherally for the better part of an hour, not with any foolish romantic hope. She had abandoned such fantasies years ago. Rather, she watched him the way she watched everything, with the quiet attention of someone who existed on the margins and had learned to find meaning in observation itself. She was so absorbed in her study that she failed to notice Lady Honoria's approach until her stepmother's voice sliced through the general murmur of conversation like a blade through silk. "Poor Eloise." Honoria's voice carried across the immediate area with the perfect projection of someone who wished to be overheard. Her stepmother stood with Lady Thornbury and Mrs. Pemberton, two matrons whose opinions shaped reputations like sculptors shaped clay. So plain, so utterly forgettable. One must admire her courage in attending these affairs, knowing she'll spend every evening pressed against the wallpaper like part of the decoration. Some girls simply weren't made for society's spotlight. The words landed with surgical precision. Nearby guests, Lady Thornbury in peacock blue, Mrs. Pemberton with her elaborate coiffure, several others whose names Eloise had long since stopped trying to remember, tittered behind painted fans. The sound was delicate, feminine, and absolutely merciless. Eloise's fingers tightened on her own fan until the mother-of-pearl sticks threatened to crack. Her face, she knew, remained composed. Years of practice had taught her to school her features into pleasant neutrality, to absorb insults the way stone absorbed rain, silently, giving nothing back, but inside, something fractured. Not broke. She had endured too much to break over mere words, but cracked, like porcelain, developing a hairline fracture that would spread, eventually, into something irreparable. She became aware of other eyes turning toward her. The assessment was swift and unanimous. Yes, poor plain Eloise, exactly as Lady Vexley described. The consensus was almost visible in the slight nods, the knowing glances exchanged between matrons and debutantes alike. "I say, Hawthorne?" Lord Fitzwilliam's voice rose above the whispers, loud enough that Eloise heard every syllable, despite the 30 feet separating them. "Show the poor girl some kindness, won't you? One dance wouldn't kill you. Might even be considered charitable. The season's nearly done, and I doubt she's had a single partner all spring." Eloise's breath caught. She hadn't realized the Duke's attention, or his friends, had turned in her direction at all. For one terrible, hopeful moment, she made the mistake of looking directly at Alistair Hawthorne. His storm-grey eyes met hers across the expanse of gleaming floor. The contact lasted perhaps 3 seconds, long enough for her to see the assessment in his gaze, the brief consideration, and then the dismissal. He looked away as one might look away from something vaguely distasteful. When he spoke, his voice carried the bored drawl of absolute certainty, the tone of a man who had never questioned whether his opinions held weight. "I dance with ladies who elevate my standing fits, not diminish it. I have no interest in charity cases, particularly those who seem expressly designed by nature to blend into the drapery. Some people are simply meant to be overlooked." The words hung in the air like smoke. Conversation didn't stop, that would have been too obvious, but it shifted, the way a flock of birds shifts direction as one organism. People pretended not to have heard while ensuring they missed not a single word. Eloise could feel their satisfaction, their vindication. Here was confirmation of what they all believed. She was beneath notice, unworthy even of pity. Lady Honoria's smile was triumphant, sharp as cut glass. For a long moment, Eloise simply stood there, her untouched glass of champagne growing warm in her gloved hand. She could feel the weight of their expectations settling on her shoulders like a physical thing. They expected tears, expected her to flee in humiliation, expected some dramatic display of feminine distress that would provide entertainment for the remainder of the evening and gossip fodder for the week to follow. She would not give them that satisfaction. With movements as deliberate as a dancer's, Eloise set down her champagne glass on a nearby table. She met Lady Honoria's gaze directly, saw the challenge there, the triumph, the casual cruelty that had characterized their relationship since her father's remarriage 9 years ago. Then, without a word, she turned and walked toward the ballroom's exit. She did not hurry, did not gather her skirts and run. She simply moved through the crowd with measured grace, her spine straight, her face composed. The sea of silk and jewels parted slightly to let her pass, whispers trailing in her wake like foam behind a ship. Did you hear what the Duke said? Designed to blend into the drapery? How devastating. Poor thing, though he's not wrong, is he? Where is she going? Probably to compose herself in private. How mortifying. Eloise heard none of it. Or rather, she heard all of it, and let it wash over her without penetration, the way one might stand in rain without truly feeling wet. She had learned this skill over years of being the object of such commentary. The terrace doors stood open to admit the cool April evening. She stepped through them into darkness, punctuated by starlight, into air that smelled of damp earth and distant gardens rather than perfume and candle wax. Out here, the sounds of the ballroom became muffled, violin music and laughter reduced to a pleasant murmur, like the ocean heard from a great distance. Eloise moved to the stone balustrade and gripped it with both hands, grateful for the cool solidity of marble beneath her fingers. The night sky stretched above her, vast and indifferent. Stars glittered with cold beauty, utterly unconcerned with the dramas unfolding in ballrooms below. For the first time that evening, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Eloise allowed her composure to crack. A single tear slid down her cheek, warm against her cool skin. She brushed it away quickly, almost angrily. "I will not break," she whispered to the indifferent stars. "I will not give them that satisfaction." The words were a vow, a promise to herself that whatever happened next, she would endure it with the same quiet dignity she had cultivated over years of being invisible, overlooked, dismissed. Behind her, the ball continued. The Duke of Hawthorne doubtless danced with ladies who elevated his standing. Lady Honoria accepted compliments on her wisdom in managing such a difficult stepdaughter. The world turned on its axis, utterly unchanged by one unremarkable woman's humiliation. Eloise stood alone on the terrace until the cold drove her inside, and then she slipped through the corridors of Ashford Manor to find a footman to summon her carriage. She did not return to the ballroom. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that this night would mark the last time Eloise Fairwind allowed anyone else to define her worth. By morning, her exile would begin, and with it, her transformation. The morning room of Harrow House received light through tall windows that overlooked a garden Eloise's mother had once tended with her own hands. Lady Honoria sat at the mahogany table, pouring tea with movements of studied elegance, as though this were any ordinary breakfast. Eloise stood near the doorway, still in her dressing gown, summoned before she'd had time to properly dress. "Sit," Honoria commanded, not looking up. Eloise sat. The tea her stepmother poured was too hot, too bitter. She didn't drink it. "I've made arrangements," Honoria announced, setting down the silver pot with a decisive clink. "You're to go to Stormhaven Cottage. It's one of your father's old properties on the Hawthorne estate in Cornwall. The air will do you good, and frankly, your presence here has become a liability to Seraphina's prospects. After last night's spectacle, I can hardly have you lurking about, reminding everyone of our less fortunate connections." The words took a moment to penetrate. Stormhaven Cottage. Eloise had heard her father mention it once or twice, a small holding on the coast, part of a complicated arrangement with the Hawthorne family dating back generations. She'd never seen it. "You're sending me away," Eloise said quietly. I'm providing you with a comfortable retreat where you won't be subjected to the rigors of society that so clearly overwhelm you." Honoria's smile was sharp as winter frost. "After last night, it's evident that London is not a suitable environment for your temperament. In Cornwall, you can occupy yourself with whatever simple pursuits suit you. Reading, perhaps. Long walks. The contemplation of nature, and your place in the natural order of things." The subtext landed like stones. "In Cornwall, you will be invisible. You will not embarrass me with your existence. You will cease to matter in any way." "And if I refuse?" Eloise asked, though she already knew. Honoria's eyes hardened to flint. "This house belongs to the Harrow estate, which I control as your father's widow until Seraphina's marriage is secured. You have a small independence from your mother, barely £300 a year, hardly enough to maintain yourself respectably in London. You may choose to use it establishing yourself in some dingy set of rooms in an unfashionable quarter, subject to gossip about what scandal drove you from your family home. Or you may accept my generous offer of Stormhaven, where you may live in dignified privacy with a housekeeper to attend you. The choice, as they say, is entirely yours." It was no choice at all, and they both knew it. Honoria had planned this carefully, had perhaps been waiting for the perfect excuse. Last night's humiliation had simply provided it. "When?" Eloise's voice came out steadier than she felt. "4 days. I've already sent word to Mrs. Aldwyn, she keeps the cottage, to prepare for your arrival. Really, Eloise, you should be grateful. Not every stepmother would be so considerate of your well-being." That afternoon, Eloise stood in her childhood bedroom, packing by the pale light filtering through lace curtains. She had few enough possessions that the work went quickly. Clothing, mostly simple and unfashionable. A handful of books, including her mother's annotated copy of Wordsworth's poems, the cameo brooch, carefully wrapped, a miniature portrait of her parents on their wedding day when her mother's eyes had still held light and her father had smiled like he believed in happiness. She held the portrait for a long moment, studying her mother's face. Had she known, on that bright morning, that she would die before her daughter turned 14? That her second husband would remarry within 18 months? That her daughter would be sent away like an unwanted parcel? "I'm sorry, Mama," Eloise whispered. "I tried to be what they wanted." Outside her window, London continued its glittering existence. Somewhere, Lady Honoria was accepting afternoon callers, spinning the narrative of Eloise's retreat into something respectable. Somewhere, the Duke of Hawthorne was attending to whatever occupied dukes when they weren't casually destroying people with their words. Eloise folded the last of her stockings and closed the trunk. Cornwall, then. The edge of the world. A place she'd never seen, on land, technically belonging to the man who'd called her forgettable. The irony wasn't lost on her. She wondered, as she climbed into bed that night for one of her last sleeps in this house, whether she would ever return to London. Whether anyone would notice if she didn't. Whether being forgotten by this world might be the beginning of discovering another. The answer, she would learn, was yes. The journey to Cornwall took 4 days of rattling roads and changing horses, and with each mile, London's polished elegance gave way to something wilder, more honest. Eloise watched through the coach window as manicured parks became rolling countryside, then rough moorland, and finally, on the 4th afternoon, the first glimpse of the sea. It stretched to the horizon like hammered pewter under a grey sky, vast and indifferent, and somehow exactly what Eloise needed to see. Stormhaven Cottage appeared at the end of a rutted lane that wound along the cliff tops. Cottage was a generous term. The structure was built of dark stone that seemed to have grown from the earth itself, 2 stories of weathered walls and narrow windows that stared out at the ocean like wary eyes. Salt spray had left white traces on the slate roof. Wild grass grew thick around the foundations, bending and whipping in the constant wind. It looked, Eloise thought as the coach rolled to a stop, less like a house and more like something wounded that had crawled here to hide. The front door opened before she could knock, and a woman emerged who seemed carved from the same stern material as the landscape. Mrs. Aldwyn was perhaps 50, with iron-grey hair pulled severely back and hands that looked like they'd spent decades doing real work. She wore a plain grey dress and an apron, and her face held the kind of weathered capability that came from surviving harsh seasons. "Lady Eloise?" Her voice was rough but not unkind. "Welcome to Stormhaven. Your trunks will be brought in shortly. Come inside before the wind tears through you." The interior was sparse. A narrow hallway opened into a sitting room with bare walls and furniture covered in dust sheets. The air smelled of salt and disuse and something indefinable, the scent of a place that had been waiting, empty, for someone to remember it existed. "It's not what you're accustomed to, I expect," Mrs. Aldwyn said, following Eloise's gaze around the dim space. "The family hasn't kept the place properly staffed in 20 years. It's just me now and old Thomas who does the heavy work when his joints allow. But the roof is sound, the fireplace is drawer, and the pantry's stocked. You'll not starve at least." She didn't pity. That was the first thing Eloise noticed. Mrs. Aldwyn spoke to her as one might speak to any adult capable of understanding basic facts, not as one spoke to a fragile creature who'd been banished in disgrace. "Thank you," Eloise said quietly. "I'm sure it will be perfectly adequate." Mrs. Aldwyn's expression shifted, something that might have been approval flickering in her stern features. "I'll show you to your room. Supper's at 7, simple fare, fish stew and bread. If you need anything fancy, you'll need to send to the village, and that's 3 miles in good weather." The bedroom was on the second floor, facing the sea. It held a narrow bed, a wardrobe, a washstand, and a small writing desk pushed against the window. Eloise stood at that window as Mrs. Aldwyn left, staring out at the grey water churning against dark rocks far below. This was exile. This was what society had decided she deserved, a stone box at the edge of the world, where no one would have to look at her unremarkable face and be reminded that not everyone could be beautiful. That first night, Eloise lay in the unfamiliar bed and listened to the wind howl around the cottage like something alive and angry. The isolation pressed against her chest like a physical weight. In London, even in her loneliness, she'd been surrounded by voices, movement, the constant hum of the city. Here, there was only wind and waves and the vast, indifferent dark. She pulled her mother's shawl tighter around her shoulders and wondered what she was supposed to do with all the empty days stretching before her, like the empty sea. The tears came then, finally, not the single controlled tear of the ballroom terrace, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. She cried for her mother, for her father's weakness, for the girl she'd been who still believed that being good and quiet and agreeable would somehow be enough. When the tears finally stopped, Eloise felt hollow, but somehow lighter, like something had been purged. The next morning dawned grey and cold. After a breakfast of porridge and strong tea, Eloise wrapped herself in her cloak and walked out into the wind. The cliffs stretched in both directions, wild and beautiful in their bleakness. She walked without destination, simply moving, trying not to collapse under the crushing sense of being unwanted, of being thrown away. But the wind and the sea didn't care that she was plain. The gulls wheeling overhead didn't judge her worth by her face. The rocks didn't whisper behind their hands. For the first time in years, Eloise walked without feeling watched. It was, she realized with a strange, sharp surprise, almost like being free. The walks became Eloise's ritual. Every morning after breakfast, regardless of weather, she wrapped herself in her cloak and walked the cliff tops. Mrs. Aldwyn approved without comment, simply ensuring Eloise had sturdy boots and warning her away from the most dangerous edges where the rock crumbled toward the churning water below. It was during one of these walks, perhaps 3 weeks into her exile, that Eloise first picked up a piece of charcoal. She'd been watching the way light broke through clouds to silver-stripe the sea, trying to memorize the particular beauty of it, when her fingers found a bit of burned driftwood in the grass. Without thinking, she began to sketch on a flat section of rock, just rough lines at first, trying to capture the angle of light, the curve of waves against stone. The drawing was crude, unschooled, but something about the act of making it, of translating what she saw into marks on stone, felt like a door opening in her chest. She sketched the cliffs, the cottage hunched against the wind, a fishing boat far out on the water. By the time she returned home, her fingers were black with charcoal and her mind was quieter than it had been in weeks. Mrs. Aldwyn found the drawings by accident when she went to clear away Eloise's breakfast dishes and discovered the papers spread across the writing desk. Rough sketches done with charcoal on the backs of old letters, studies of waves and rocks and the way grass bent in wind. "These are good," she said that evening, not as flattery, but as simple fact. Eloise, startled, looked up from her book. "They're nothing, just something to occupy my hands." "They're not nothing." Mrs. Aldwyn set down the tea tray with a decisive thump. "I've seen the paintings in the great houses when I was in service. You've got an eye, Lady Eloise. These capture something true." The words lodged somewhere in Eloise's chest, unexpected as sudden warmth. The next week, a village woman appeared at the cottage door. Her name was Betty Thorne, and she held the hand of a small girl with tangled brown hair and wary eyes. "Begging your pardon, my lady," Betty said, twisting her apron. "Mrs. Aldwyn mentioned you might. That is, my Annie needs learning, her letters and sums. The vicar tries, but he's got too many. And Annie, she's bright, but she needs someone patient." The girl, Annie, stared at Eloise with fierce intensity, as though daring her to say no. "I'm not a governess," Eloise said slowly. "I've never taught anyone." "But you can read and write and do your figures?" Betty pressed. "That's more than most of us have. I can pay a little, or I can—" "No payment," Eloise interrupted. She looked at Annie, saw something of her own loneliness reflected in those guarded eyes. "But if Annie wants to learn, I'll teach her. We can start tomorrow, if that suits." The next afternoon, Annie Thorne sat at Eloise's small writing desk, carefully forming letters with a pencil stub, while Eloise guided her hand. The child's fierce concentration, the way her face lit up when she successfully wrote her own name, these things stirred something in Eloise she hadn't known was sleeping. "You're good at this," Annie said suddenly, looking up with those two old eyes. "Better than the vicar. He gets impatient." "Perhaps," Eloise said softly. "It's because I know what it's like to feel overlooked." That evening, as she sketched by candlelight, Eloise realized something had shifted. In London, her ability to read, to calculate, to observe and understand had been worthless, decorative skills at best in a world that valued only beauty and birth. Here, in this forgotten corner of the world, those same abilities suddenly mattered. She could draw what she saw, and it meant something. She could teach a child to read, and it changed something. For the first time since the ballroom, Eloise felt the faint stirring of purpose. Not the borrowed purpose of making herself acceptable to society, but something that belonged to her alone. She didn't know it yet, but these were the first stitches in the life she was about to create. The life no one in London could have imagined for the girl they'd dismissed as too plain to notice. Spring softened into summer, and with it, Eloise's world expanded in ways she never could have predicted. The sketchbooks multiplied. What had started as idle drawings of seascapes became something more deliberate, studies of faces, hands, the way light fell across weathered skin. She sketched Mrs. Aldwyn kneading bread, her capable hands dusted with flour. Annie Thorne's fierce concentration as she practiced her letters. Old Thomas repairing the cottage gate, his gnarled fingers surprisingly deft with hammer and nail. She was learning to see people, truly see them, in a way she'd never been allowed to see or be seen in London's glittering ballrooms. Annie's mother, Betty, mentioned Eloise's teaching to other women in the village. Within a month, 2 more children appeared at the cottage door, a fisherman's son who wanted to learn his numbers so he could keep better accounts, and a girl named Molly whose quick mind had nowhere to go in a world that expected her only to gut fish and mend nets. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Blackwood, arrived one afternoon with a proposal delivered in her brisk, practical manner. "We've a storage room attached to the chapel," she said over tea in Eloise's sparse sitting room. "Nothing grand, but it's dry and gets good light. If you're willing to make the lessons more regular, more children would come. Their parents trust you. Betty Thorne's been singing your praises to anyone who'll listen. You've a gift for making them feel capable rather than stupid." Eloise stared at her, uncertain whether this was charity or something else. "I don't want your pity, Mrs. Blackwood." "Good, because I'm not offering it." The vicar's wife set down her teacup with a decisive clink. "I'm offering you work that matters. These children need someone who sees their worth. You, if I may be frank, need something to pour yourself into besides grief and exile. It's practical for everyone." The makeshift school began in July. What had been a dusty storage room gradually transformed. Thomas built rough benches, Mrs. Aldwyn donated old blankets to soften the stone floor, and Eloise spent careful portions of her small independence on slates, chalk, primers, and paper. She taught reading and writing, basic mathematics, a little geography. She showed the girls her sketches and encouraged them to try their own.
But more than that, she taught them that their minds mattered, that being able to read a contract or calculate fair payment wasn't just practical, it was power. The children came, at first hesitantly, then with growing confidence. Their mothers began to linger after lessons, asking questions of their own. Could Lady Eloise show them how to write their names? How to read a recipe properly? How to keep household accounts so the merchants couldn't cheat them? By autumn, the storage room held not just children but women of all ages, crowded onto benches and sitting cross-legged on the floor, their work-roughened hands carefully forming letters, their faces fierce with concentration. Eloise had never felt more alive. In London's ballrooms, she'd been a shadow, a placeholder, someone who existed only to make others look better by comparison. Here, in this salt-scoured village at the edge of the world, she was someone who changed things, who mattered. She sketched her students constantly, portraits that captured Betty Thorne's tired pride, Annie's fierce intelligence, old Thomas's weathered dignity. Her drawings grew bolder, more confident. She was learning not just to see but to reveal, to show the worth in faces the wider world would never notice. One evening, as she sat at her desk with lamplight falling across her latest sketchbook, Eloise caught her own reflection in the darkened window. The same face that London had dismissed looked back at her, but the woman behind it was different, stronger, clearer, purposeful. She thought of the Duke's words that terrible night, expressly designed by nature to blend into the drapery. Let him think so, she decided. Let all of them think so. Because while they'd been watching for beauty, she'd been building something far more dangerous, a life that was entirely, defiantly her own. I need to pause our story here for just a moment, my friend, because I have to be honest with you about something that's been weighing on my heart. Thousands of you watch these stories every single week. You spend 30, 40, sometimes 50 minutes with me, following these characters through heartbreak and transformation. You tell me in the comments how much these tales mean to you, how they help you through difficult times, how you see yourself in characters like Eloise. But here's the truth that hurts. Less than 3% of you have subscribed. Think about that. You're here, right now, invested in Eloise's journey. You want to know what happens when she returns to London, when the Duke sees what he dismissed, when she has to choose between the life she's built and the world that rejected her. But if you don't subscribe, if you don't leave even a single comment, the algorithm decides this story doesn't matter. It decides you don't matter. And these stories about women who refuse to stay small, who claim their worth despite the world telling them they're not enough, these stories disappear. Is that really what you want? It takes 3 seconds to subscribe, 1 sentence to leave a comment. If Eloise can transform her entire life after being publicly humiliated, surely you can tap a button for the story that's moving you right now. Subscribe, comment, choose to be part of this community instead of just passing through it. Because I promise you what happens next in Eloise's story. It's worth staying for. Now, let's continue. London in autumn carried a different quality of light than Cornwall, softer, hazier, filtered through coal smoke and fog. Alistair Hawthorne stood at the window of his study in Blackwell House, brandy in hand, staring out at the city without really seeing it. The season was well underway, and his calendar was full of the usual obligations. Parliamentary sessions, club dinners, balls where ambitious mothers paraded their daughters like prize horses at auction. He'd attended Lady Pemberton's soirée the previous evening and found himself profoundly, inexplicably bored. "Hawthorne, did you hear?" Lord Fitzwilliam had appeared at his elbow near the refreshment table, his voice carrying that particular tone of scandalous gossip. "The Fairwind girl, the plain one. You remember she's been packed off to the countryside. Cornwall, I believe. Lady Vexley sent her away after that business at the Ashford ball last spring." The words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through Alistair's carefully maintained composure. What business? He'd asked, though he knew. God help him, he knew exactly what business. "Oh, you were there. That dreadful moment when someone suggested you dance with her out of charity, and you said, what was it? Something about blending into the drapery?" Fitzwilliam chuckled, oblivious to the way Alistair's jaw tightened. Cutting, but fair. Girl had no place at society functions, probably happier in the country anyway. Alistair had excused himself shortly after, pleading an early morning appointment. Now, alone in his study, he couldn't stop thinking about that night. He'd replayed the moment dozens of times since Fitzwilliam's casual mention, seeing it with uncomfortable clarity. Eloise Fairwind's grey-green eyes meeting his across the ballroom floor, the brief flicker of hope he'd seen there, and then his dismissal, his words, designed to be clever, to cement his reputation for wit, expressly designed by nature to blend into the drapery. He'd meant it as social currency, the kind of sharp observation that kept one standing secure. He hadn't thought about her afterward, hadn't considered that words, once spoken, didn't simply evaporate, they landed, they wounded, they had consequences, and now she'd been sent away. The discomfort that settled in his chest was unfamiliar. Guilt was not an emotion Alistair Hawthorne entertained often. He'd been raised to believe in the natural order of things. Some people were born to lead, others to follow. Some were blessed with beauty and consequence, others were not. It wasn't cruelty, it was simply the way of the world. But something about this felt different, wrong. Over the following weeks, he found himself making discreet inquiries. His solicitor, Mr. Pembroke, was nothing if not thorough. Stormhaven Cottage, Your Grace, on the Cornwall coast. Technically part of the Hawthorne holdings, though the arrangement is complicated, tied to the late Mr. Fairwind's family through some ancient agreement. The property has been largely neglected for years. Lady Eloise resides there with minimal staff. A housekeeper, Mrs. Aldwyn, and an elderly groundskeeper. "And her circumstances?" Alistair had asked, studying the papers on his desk with more attention than they warranted. "Modest, Your Grace. She has a small independence from her late mother, perhaps £300 annually, enough to survive but hardly comfortable. However," Pembroke had paused, adjusting his spectacles. "There are rumours from the village. Apparently Lady Eloise has established some sort of informal school, teaching local children and women their letters and numbers. The vicar's wife speaks highly of her efforts. Quite the local heroine. From what I gather." Alistair had dismissed Pembroke shortly after, but the information haunted him. She was teaching village children, creating something meaningful in that forgotten corner of his estate. The girl he'd dismissed as decorative at best was proving to have more substance than anyone had credited. The guilt deepened, became something he couldn't ignore. He began sending resources through Pembroke, always anonymously. Books, primers for children, volumes on mathematics and natural philosophy. Art supplies, though he wasn't certain why those felt important. Funds to repair the chapel's storage room that had been converted into a classroom. He told himself it was simple responsibility for tenants on his land, but he knew it was more than that. It was penance. A way to ease the discomfort that had taken root in his chest. Pembroke brought regular reports. The school was thriving. Lady Eloise's reputation in the village was growing. She'd painted portraits of several local families, refusing payment but accepting gifts of food, firewood, practical things. She was, by all accounts, respected and needed in a way she'd never been in London. Alistair sat in his study one evening, Pembroke's latest report in hand, and felt the full weight of what he'd done. Not just his words that night, though, those were damning enough, but his participation in a system that had measured Eloise Fairwind against arbitrary standards and found her wanting. A system that had, in doing so, nearly destroyed someone who was clearly extraordinary in ways that had nothing to do with conventional beauty. She was blooming, Pembroke's report suggested, building a life of purpose and meaning, and she was doing it in exile, because his world, his words had rejected her. The knowledge sat in his chest like a stone he couldn't dislodge. He'd wronged her, not through malice but through thoughtless cruelty, which was somehow worse. And now she was far away, becoming someone remarkable, and he had no right to any part of it. Still, he kept sending the anonymous gifts, kept receiving the reports, kept watching from a distance, haunted by the woman he'd helped to banish and the life she'd created despite him. He told himself it was atonement, but late at night, when Brandy loosened his carefully maintained defenses, he suspected it was something more complicated, something that felt uncomfortably like regret for losing something he'd never known he could want.
The mirror in Eloise's bedroom had been there when she arrived, an old thing, silvering at the edges, the glass slightly warped so that reflections appeared softer than reality. She'd avoided looking at it for months, seeing only what she needed to see. That her hair was braided, her dress fastened, her appearance respectable enough for teaching. But on a grey morning in late October, nearly 18 months after her arrival in Cornwall, Eloise found herself standing before that mirror, really looking at herself for the first time in longer than she could remember. The face was the same unremarkable features that London had dismissed. Her eyes were still that indeterminate grey-green, her hair still plain brown without Seraphina's golden luster. Her nose was still slightly too strong, her mouth too wide. Her complexion sun-touched from her daily walks rather than fashionably pale. But something fundamental had changed. The woman in the mirror stood differently, spine straight, not from deportment lessons, but from genuine confidence. Her eyes held clarity rather than the defensive wariness she'd carried through 5 London seasons. The softness in her expression wasn't weakness anymore, it was strength that didn't need to announce itself. She wore a simple dress of dark blue wool, practical and unfashionable, and somehow that felt right in a way silk and lace never had. I am not the girl who left London, Eloise thought, meeting her own gaze in the warped glass. I am not living like someone waiting to be forgiven. I am living like someone with purpose. The realization settled into her bones with quiet certainty. A knock on the door broke her reverie. Mrs. Aldwyn entered with her usual brisk efficiency, carrying a letter on a silver tray that looked absurdly formal in the cottage's sparse surroundings. "This came by special courier from London," she said, her tone suggesting this was unusual enough to warrant immediate attention. "The seal's from a solicitor's office." Eloise took the letter with hands that wanted to shake but didn't. She recognized the name embossed on the wax, Thornbury and Sons, her father's old solicitors. Nothing good ever came from solicitors bearing urgent news. She broke the seal and read quickly, Mrs. Aldwyn waiting with patient silence. Her great-aunt Marguerite had died. There was an inheritance, not substantial, but enough to complicate matters. More importantly, several of Eloise's sketches had somehow made their way to London through a vicar's connection, and a gallery owner wanted to discuss exhibiting them. The solicitor strongly suggested her presence in town to manage these affairs personally. "Bad news?" Mrs. Aldwyn asked. "Complicated news?" Eloise folded the letter carefully, her mind already racing ahead. "I need to go to London, for a few weeks at least." The old fear rose immediately, visceral and familiar. London meant Lady Honoria's drawing room and Seraphina's brilliant presence and ballrooms full of people who'd watched her humiliation and dismissed her existence. It meant facing the Duke of Hawthorne again, if their paths crossed. It meant walking back into the world that had decided she wasn't enough. But then Eloise looked around her small bedroom, at the stack of sketchbooks on her desk, the children's primer she'd been annotating, the dried flowers Annie Thorne had given her last week. She thought of Betty asking her to witness her signature on a property deed, of old Thomas showing her his granddaughter's first written letter with gruff pride, of the classroom full of women and girls who'd learned to see their own worth through her patient teaching. She had something now that she hadn't had 18 months ago. Something London couldn't give her and couldn't take away. She had proof that she mattered, that her gifts had value, that she could build a life on her own terms. The fear was still there, she suspected it always would be, but it was smaller now, manageable. She could weigh it against everything she'd created here, everything she'd become, and find it wanting. "When do you need to leave?" Mrs. Aldwyn asked. "Within the week." Eloise met the older woman's gaze. "Will you manage things here? The school, I mean. Betty can help with the younger children and—" "We'll manage." Mrs. Aldwyn's stern face softened just slightly. "You've built something strong, Lady Eloise. It won't collapse the moment you step away. That's how you know it's real." That evening, Eloise sat at her desk and began a letter to the solicitor confirming her arrival date. Her hand moved across the paper with steady confidence, the same hand that had sketched Cornwall's cliffs and taught children their letters and created a life from the ruins of rejection. London might not have changed. The people who'd dismissed her might still see only the plain face they'd always seen. But she had changed, and that, Eloise realized as she sealed the letter with wax, made all the difference. She would return to London. Not as the girl they'd banished, but as the woman she'd become in spite of them. And if they couldn't see her worth now, well, that said far more about them than it ever had about her. Harrow House looked exactly as Eloise remembered it, tall and elegant in the Mayfair style, its cream-coloured facade pristine, its windows glittering in the afternoon sun. She stood on the pavement for a long moment before climbing the steps, her single trunk already deposited by the coach driver who'd regarded her simple travelling dress with barely concealed disdain. The door opened before she could knock. Matthews, the butler who'd served her father, stood in the entrance, his expression carefully neutral. "Lady Eloise, we received word of your arrival. Lady Vexley is in the drawing room." He paused and something flickered in his formal demeanour. "Welcome home, my lady." The kindness in those last words steadied her. Eloise found Lady Honoria precisely where she'd always been found, in the drawing room, pouring tea with studied grace, surrounded by carefully chosen furniture and fresh flowers that spoke of wealth and taste. Seraphina sat beside her stepmother, resplendent in a gown of apricot silk that made her look like a sunset given human form. "Eloise." Honoria's smile was sharp as ever. "How rustic you look. Cornwall has certainly left its mark. All that sun and sea air, quite aging, I'm afraid. But then, I suppose, when one has nothing to preserve, it matters less." The words were designed to wound, delivered with the precision of long practice. 18 months ago they would have landed. Eloise would have dropped her gaze, made herself smaller, apologized for existing. Instead, she met Honoria's eyes directly and smiled. "Cornwall has been remarkably good for me, actually. I've learned a great deal about what matters and what doesn't." She settled into a chair uninvited, a guest rather than a supplicant. "I'm here for legal matters regarding Aunt Marguerite's estate and to meet with a gallery owner about exhibiting my work. I'll be staying at the Cavendish Hotel." Seraphina's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose. "A hotel? But surely you'll stay here at your family home." "This stopped being my home when Lady Vexley sent me away," Eloise said calmly. "I'm here on business, not sentiment. The hotel suits me perfectly." The room's atmosphere shifted. And this wasn't the script they'd expected. The plain, biddable Eloise, who'd absorbed insults without complaint, was supposed to have returned, humbled, grateful for any acknowledgement, desperate to be allowed back into their good graces. Instead, they faced a woman who spoke to them as equals, who didn't need their approval. "Art?" Honoria recovered quickly, her tone dripping with condescension. Surely you don't imagine anyone in London society cares about your little sketches? I imagine the Pemberton Gallery cares, since they've offered me an exhibition. Eloise accepted tea from Matthews with a grateful nod. But I'm not concerned with society's opinion anymore. I've found an audience that values substance over surface. The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown. The London season had begun its autumn phase when Eloise attended her first significant event, a reception at the Royal Academy, where her small exhibition was being mounted in one of the lesser galleries. She'd debated attending at all, but the gallery owner, Mr. Whitmore, had insisted that the artist's presence would help sales. She wore a dress she'd commissioned from a modest dressmaker, deep forest green, simply cut, with none of the elaborate flourishes that were currently fashionable. Her hair was arranged in her usual braids, adorned only with her mother's cameo. She looked, she knew, nothing like the glittering creatures who dominated London's drawing rooms. She looked like herself, and for the first time that felt like enough. Mademoiselle Fairwind? The voice was warmly accented, French with a careful English overlay. Eloise turned to find a man in his early 30s approaching with a genuine smile that reached his dark eyes. He was handsome in an open, approachable way, dark hair, olive skin, impeccably tailored coat. Lady Eloise, she corrected gently. Ah, forgive me, Count Léon Beaumont. He bowed with continental grace. I have been admiring your work for the past hour. These portraits, they are extraordinary. You capture something essential in your subjects. This woman here, he gestured to Eloise's portrait of Betty Thorne. I feel I know her entire story from her eyes alone. Eloise felt warmth spread through her chest. You see it? Most people look at fishing village portraits and see only poverty or quaintness. Then most people are fools. Léon's smile was entirely without guile. You show dignity, strength, the beauty that comes from surviving difficult lives with grace. This is art that matters, Lady Eloise, not the simpering society portraits that hang in every drawing room, all looking the same because they show nothing real. They talked for nearly an hour, about art, about the responsibility of seeing people truly, about Cornwall's wild beauty and Paris's different kind of magnificence. Léon was a second son, a diplomat of sorts, with no need to marry for fortune, and a genuine passion for supporting artists who created meaningful work. You must allow me to introduce your work to connections in Paris, he said earnestly. They would appreciate what you're doing far more than London society ever will. Eloise was about to respond when she felt it, that particular prickling awareness of being watched. She turned and met Alistair Hawthorne's gaze across the gallery. He stood near the entrance, perfectly composed as always, but something in his expression had cracked. He was staring at her portrait of Mrs. King Aldwyn with an intensity that seemed almost painful, and then his eyes moved to Eloise herself. The recognition in his face was complicated, surprise, certainly, but also something that looked uncomfortably like regret. Eloise held his gaze for 3 heartbeats, then turned back to Léon with a smile. Paris sounds wonderful, she said. Tell me more. Behind her, she felt, rather than saw, the Duke of Hawthorne's world tilt on its axis. He'd expected to find the girl he'd dismissed. Instead, he'd discovered a woman who no longer needed his notice to know her own worth. And that, Eloise thought with quiet satisfaction, was the most powerful transformation of all. The invitation came a week after the gallery reception. Delivered on heavy cream paper with elegant script, Lady Ashford requests the pleasure of your company at a private musicale and supper, the same Lady Ashford whose ballroom had been the site of Eloise's humiliation 18 months ago. Eloise held the invitation for a long moment, considering whether to accept. Part of her, the part that still carried scars, wanted to refuse, but another part, the part that had learned to face difficult things in Cornwall, recognized an opportunity. She would not hide, not anymore. The evening arrived cool and clear. Eloise wore her forest green dress again, having discovered that owning her simplicity was more powerful than attempting to compete with London's elaborate fashions. She arrived fashionably late, alone, and walked into Lady Ashford's drawing room with her spine straight and her head high. The room fell into that particular kind of silence that meant everyone was watching while pretending not to. Lady Honoria and Serafina occupied their usual position of prominence, the latter ethereal in blush pink silk. Count Leon was there, brightening immediately when he saw Eloise and making his way to her side with genuine pleasure. And in the corner, nursing a whiskey and looking profoundly uncomfortable, stood Duke Alistair Hawthorne. Lady Eloise. Lady Ashford herself approached, curiosity bright in her eyes. How delightful that you could join us. I understand your work at the Pemberton Gallery has been quite the conversation piece. People do seem to be talking about it, Eloise said calmly. Well, yes. Lady Ashford's smile was careful. Though I confess, when you left London, we all thought, that is, Lady Vexley gave us to understand you'd retired to the country for your health. My health was fine. Eloise's voice carried clearly. I was sent away because Lady Vexley found my appearance embarrassing to the family's social standing. I believe the phrase used was that I was too plain to be seen in society. The silence deepened. Several guests looked determinedly at their drinks. Others glanced between Eloise and Lady Honoria with the avid interest of those watching a drama unfold. Honoria's face had gone rigid. Really, Eloise, there's no need to be dramatic. We simply thought the country would suit you better. Because I was too plain to be acceptable in London. Eloise spoke without anger, stating simple fact. Let's not pretend otherwise. You were quite clear about it at the time. Serafina shifted uncomfortably, a crack appearing in her perfect composure. Eloise, it wasn't like that. We only wanted... What you wanted, Eloise interrupted gently but firmly, was for me to disappear, to stop being a reminder that not everyone fits society's narrow definition of acceptable. And I did disappear for a time, but I didn't fade away as you expected. I built something real instead. The room was utterly still now. Even the servants had stopped moving. The portraits at the Pemberton Gallery, Eloise continued, those are the people of the village where I was sent. Fishermen's wives, children learning their letters, women who'd never been taught they mattered. I showed them their own dignity, their own worth. And in doing so, I finally learned mine. She turned to face the room fully, her voice steady. I was told I was too plain to deserve space in this world, that I should be grateful for charity, for scraps of attention, for being tolerated. I believed it for far too long, but plainness isn't a moral failing. It's simply an arbitrary standard created by people who needed someone to look down on to feel superior. Lady Eloise. The voice came from the corner, low and rough. Alistair Hawthorne stepped forward, and Eloise saw something in his face she'd never seen before. Genuine shame. May I speak? He asked, not commanding but requesting. Eloise nodded once. 18 months ago, in a ballroom much like this one, I said something unforgivably cruel about you. His grey eyes held hers, unflinching. I said you were designed to blend into the drapery. I said it to be clever, to cement my own reputation for wit. I didn't think about what those words would do. I didn't think about you as a person at all. The admission fell into the silence, like a stone into water. You were sent away because of that night, Alistair continued. Because of what I said, and what I represented. And I have spent the past year learning exactly what you made of that exile. The school you built, the lives you changed, the art you created that captures more truth than any society portrait ever has. He paused, something raw and honest in his expression. I was wrong, not just about you, though I was catastrophically wrong about you, but about what matters, What makes someone worthy of notice, of respect, of consideration? You have more substance in one honest portrait than I've had in 31 years of supposedly impeccable breeding. The words were awkward, unpolished, nothing like Alistair Hawthorne's usual smooth assurance. That's what made them real. "I cannot undo what I did," he said quietly. "Cannot erase those words or the pain they caused, but I can stand here, in front of the same people who heard me dismiss you, and tell them and you that I was profoundly, inexcusably wrong. You are not forgettable, you are remarkable, and I am sorry." Eloise studied him for a long moment, searching for insincerity and finding none. The apology wouldn't erase the hurt, wouldn't undo the exile, but it was real, and that mattered. Before she could respond, Léon stepped forward with his warm, open smile. "Lady Eloise," he said, his accent more pronounced with emotion, "I too have something to say. I have known you only a short time, but what I see is a woman of extraordinary talent and substance. Your art matters, your work matters, you matter, not because of what society thinks, but because of what you have chosen to create." He took her hand, gently. "Come to Paris with me. Not as my wife, though I would be honored if you one day wished it, but as an artist. I have connections to galleries, to patrons who support work that challenges and enlightens. You could continue your teaching, your art, your purpose, but free from the judgment of a society that never deserved you in the first place." The offer hung in the air, genuine and generous and full of possibility. Two paths, two versions of recognition. One offered by the world that had rejected her, now willing to reclaim her. The other offered by a man who'd seen her worth from the beginning and wanted to support it unconditionally. Eloise looked between them, the Duke with his hard-won humility and the Count with his uncomplicated admiration, and realized something profound. The choice wasn't really about them at all. It was about what she would choose for herself. Eloise stood in the gallery 3 days later, alone except for the portraits watching from the walls. The exhibition would close tomorrow, and Mr. Whitmore had informed her that nearly every piece had sold. She'd become, improbably, a modest success. But that wasn't what mattered as she stood before her portrait of Mrs. Aldwyn, studying the weathered face she'd rendered with such care. Both offers still stood. Alistair had called twice, proper and respectful, asking only for the chance to know her as she truly was, to earn the right to her consideration. Léon had written a long letter detailing exactly what Paris could offer: galleries, patrons, artistic freedom, and his own steadfast support with no conditions attached. London hummed outside the gallery walls, the same London that had measured her and found her wanting, the same drawing rooms and ballrooms where she'd spent 5 seasons making herself invisible, but also the same London where Mrs. Pemberton had quietly mentioned that her niece needed tutoring, and would Lady Eloise be willing? Where 3 society matrons had approached her at Lady Ashford's musicale, asking in hushed voices if she might teach their daughters to draw, to see the world more honestly. Where even Lady Thornbury had admitted grudgingly that those portraits showed real skill. The city hadn't changed, but cracks were appearing in its perfect surface. Places where substance might matter more than surface, where a woman who painted fishermen's wives might have something valuable to offer. And Cornwall waited, the cottage with its salt-stained windows, the classroom full of eager faces, the cliffs where she'd first learned to see clearly. Betty and Annie and Mrs. Aldwyn and all the others who'd helped her discover that worth wasn't given by society. It was claimed by living purposefully. Eloise thought about Alistair's transformation. How shame had humbled him, made him question everything he'd been taught to value. There was something genuine in that struggle, something that made her believe he might become more than what he'd been. She thought about Léon's generosity, how he'd offered freedom without obligation, support without control, how Paris might let her work expand in ways London never would, how his uncomplicated admiration might be its own kind of gift. Both men saw her now. Both wanted to be part of her life. Both, in their own ways, were offering her something real. But standing there among her portraits, Eloise realized that what she wanted most wasn't to be chosen by either of them. It was to choose herself every single day the way she'd learned to do in Cornwall. She could return to the cottage and the school that needed her. She could split her time between Cornwall's purpose and London's opportunities. She could go to Paris and discover what else she might become. She could even eventually open her heart to love, whether from a duke who'd learned humility or a count who'd never needed to learn it. But whatever she chose, it would be because she decided it served the life she wanted to build, not because she was grateful to be wanted at all. The gallery door opened. Alistair entered quietly, stopping a respectful distance away. "I'm not here to press you," he said. "I only wanted to see the work one more time before it closes, to remind myself of what I almost missed seeing." Eloise smiled slightly. "And what do you see now?" "Truth," he said simply. "People as they actually are, not as we're trained to see them. It's uncomfortable and beautiful and important." He paused. "Like you." They stood in silence for a moment, two people who'd hurt and been hurt, learning what it meant to truly see each other. "I'm going back to Cornwall," Eloise said finally. "The school needs me, and I have work to finish there. But I'm also keeping a room at the Cavendish for when I'm in London. There are opportunities here now, things I want to explore." "And Paris?" Alistair asked carefully. "Léon has invited me to visit in the spring. I'd like to see what the art world there is like, whether there's space for the kind of work I do." She met his eyes. "I'm not making myself small anymore to fit into someone else's expectations. Not yours, not Léon's, not London society's. I'm going to live the life that makes me feel fully alive, and let everything else arrange itself around that." Something like admiration flickered in Alistair's expression. "That's exactly as it should be. If you want to be part of that life," Eloise continued quietly, "you're welcome to try, but I'm not looking for rescue or for someone to give me worth I already have. I'm looking for someone who understands that I'm complete on my own and chooses to walk beside me anyway." "That's all I want," Alistair said. "The chance to walk beside you, to learn from you, to become someone worthy of your consideration, even if you ultimately decide I'm not." It wasn't a promise of happily ever after. It wasn't a proposal or a declaration. It was something more honest, an acknowledgement that real love, if it came, would be built slowly, carefully, between two people who'd learned the hard way that worth came from within. 6 months later, Eloise stood at the window of the cottage, watching morning light silver the sea. The classroom was thriving. She'd hired 2 additional teachers from the village, women she'd taught who were now teaching others. Her portraits hung in galleries in London and Paris. And twice a month, Alistair made the long journey to Cornwall, not to rescue her or claim her, but simply to sit at her table and learn what substance looked like when it was valued over surface. Léon still wrote regularly, cheerful letters about Paris and art, and an open invitation that required no answer. She treasured his friendship, his support, his willingness to let her be exactly who she was. The life she'd built wasn't the one London had prepared her for. It was messier, more complicated, infinitely more real. It was hers. Eloise picked up her sketchbook and charcoal, preparing for her morning walk along the cliffs. She caught her reflection in the mirror as she passed, the same face that had once been called too plain to notice. She smiled at her reflection, at the woman who'd been banished and had turned exile into transformation. They'd said she was too plain to be remembered. Instead, she'd become impossible to forget, not because she'd changed her face to meet their standards, but because she'd refused to believe that plainness meant worthlessness, because she'd built a life of substance that mattered more than surface ever could. Because she'd finally learned the truth that London never taught. The most powerful thing a woman can do is decide she's enough, exactly as she is, and live that truth so completely that the world has no choice but to see it too. And in the end, that was worth more than all the ballrooms in London combined. So there it is, my friend. Eloise's journey from banished to remarkable, from invisible to unforgettable. I need to be honest with you right now. You just spent nearly an hour with this story. You felt Eloise's pain, celebrated her transformation, and witnessed her claim her worth. But if you don't subscribe, if you don't leave even a single comment, this story reaches no one else. I'm trying to reach 5,000 subscribers in the next 2 weeks, and I can't do it without you. It takes 3 seconds. Tap subscribe. Write one word in the comments. That's all. Do it for Eloise. Do it for every person who's ever been told they're not enough. Do it so more stories like this can exist. More incredible tales are coming. Stories of women who refuse to stay small, of second chances, of love earned rather than given. But only if you choose to be part of this community instead of just passing through it. Subscribe, comment, be the reason these stories survive. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. Now prove you meant it. I'll see you in the next story.